In 2012, I was living in a suburb of a small city with my boyfriend and 2 daughters, in an apartment complex in a pretty nice neighborhood. I was attending college and my boyfriend worked in the city. But because I was a young mother in college, I didn't really have a lot of friends at school, and the majority of my friends and family lived about an hour away. One weeknight, at about 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to my phone ringing from a restricted number. And it was a woman, crying.
"Jane, it's your mom. Please, come get me."
I immediately got up and started getting dressed. My mom has had problems with drugs in the past, and I love her, but I wouldn't put it past her to get herself in a bad situation. As I mentioned, my family lived an hour away, but I knew she had friends near me. I was too tired and alarmed to really worry about why she had called me from a restricted number. "Where are you?" I asked, and she replied that she was in the city close to me. I pressed her for more details, and she just kept saying,
"Please, hurry, come get me now."
For some reason, it all started to seem suspicious. The voice was cracking, and it sounded less like my mother and more like a man trying to disguise his voice, and they were pushing too hard for me to just leave my apartment and start driving without any general direction to head in. Whoever it was just kept saying that I needed to leave right now, and I think they may have said something about a car breaking down or that they were waiting for me in a car. At the time, my mom didn't have a car or a very reliable access to transportation, so in a moment of clarity, I grasped onto this detail and I asked, as nonchalantly as possible, "Are you in your car or somebody else's?" To this they responded,
"I'm in my car. Have you left?"
"My mom doesn't even have a car, you fucking psycho!" I screamed and hung up. My boyfriend was awake by this time, and he said that I should have played along once I knew it wasn't my mother so he could go out and find out who it was, but I was too shaken up at the moment to do anything but respond with absolute anger. I never found out who it was. They called back a few minutes later, and my boyfriend answered the phone, and whoever it was just breathed into it for a while before hanging up. Whoever it was that called me that night, let's not meet. I lived in New Mexico for several years before moving to the Midwest. My friend Amy and I, both females, would spend many days exploring the remote corners of New Mexico, discovering abandoned ghost towns and enjoying the quiet, desolate beauty of the desert. One afternoon in March 2010, we were traveling from Ruidoso to Albuquerque. Always up for exploring, we took a back road rather than traveling the more direct highway. One leg of our journey had us on NM55. It's a remote teeny tiny 2-lane highway. We loved those type of roads, up until that day. This part of New Mexico is flat and desolate desert. You can see for miles, and there's virtually nothing except dirt and rocks between towns, and towns can be miles apart. So we were on NM55 going north. After a few minutes, we saw a white pickup truck ahead of us going the same direction. Suddenly, he stopped his truck sideways in the middle of the highway, blocking both lanes. We were about a mile away from him, and as we got closer, we began to get uneasy. We could see no reason for him to do this. We were the only other vehicle out there, and we began wondering if we should turn around rather than come up to him and have to stop. We were about half a mile away from him when he pulled over to the opposite side of the highway, but his truck was still pointed the same direction we were going. We tried to relax a little. Surely this guy was a rancher or something. Maybe he was just checking something on his land. As we passed him, we noticed a few things. 1. There was only one person in the truck, a middle-aged guy who never took his eyes off of us, and 2, he was talking into a walkie-talkie. A few seconds after we passed him, he pulled back onto the highway and started following us, but he never got too close. He would get to within a few car lengths and then drop back a little, and then speed back up again to within a few car lengths. We were getting nervous. We realized how alone we really were. We had seen no other traffic on the road, and we hadn't told anyone about our great idea to take this detour. We checked our cell phones and neither one had signal. Typical for remote New Mexico, but scary given our situation. Amy was driving and speeding up, while I frantically checked the map, hoping to find a road that would have more traffic. There was no other road. We had to travel this one to get to the next town, Mountain Air. Turning around to go back the other way didn't seem like a good option. After a few minutes, we saw another pickup truck coming towards us. He was going very, very slowly, about 20 miles per hour, if that. This pickup was old and beat up, whereas the one behind us was newer. Amy had us up to 75 miles per hour, which wasn't typical for us on these 55 mile per hour highways, and we flew by the old pickup truck. As we passed it, we saw that it was another middle-aged guy, and he was talking into a walkie-talkie. After the white pickup passed him, he pulled a U-turn and pulled in behind it. As we watched all of this, we could see the white pickup truck guy talking into his walkie-talkie. No doubt these two knew each other. We were being deliberately followed, and for the first and only time in my life, I felt hunted. They stayed right behind us. We watched for obstacles in the road. We truly thought that old beat-up pickup guy had set up a trap in the road and our vehicle would be disabled somehow. We talked about driving into the field because we were in an SUV. But this was obviously their territory, and we were afraid of what would happen if we went off-road and got cornered. So we stayed on the highway. By now, white pickup truck guy was right on top of us. We could see him talking into the walkie-talkie, and he stayed right on our bumper. And old beat-up pickup truck guy was right on top of him. The three of us sped down the highway. The white pickup truck inched closer. His maneuvering and edging closer made it apparent that he was trying to bump us. I watched helplessly as he got to within inches of our back bumper. Amy floored it. We were passing 80 miles per hour and edging up to 90 miles per hour. The road was flat and deserted, but any little thing going wrong would have been catastrophic. We absolutely were not going to slow down or stop if we could help it. The white pickup pulled into the opposite lane and started to gain speed. The only thing we could think of was that he wanted to pass us and get in front of us. If he got in front of us and his buddy was behind us, then we'd be boxed in and trapped. We looked frantically at the rocky desert on both sides of us. Our only option was to off-road it. Should we risk it? Could we speed up through the desert and make it to safety in one piece? As we topped a small incline, we saw a sign that said Salinas Pueblo Missions National Monument, and it pointed towards a road on the left. And right at that moment, a blue pickup truck pulled out of that road and onto the highway in front of us. As we came up on the blue pickup, we saw the plate said U.S. Park Service. We looked at each other and looked behind us. Both pickup trucks did U-turns and went the other way. We followed the blue pickup to Mountain Air and then made our way to Albuquerque. I don't know exactly what those guys' intentions were, but they weren't good. There is something seriously wrong out there. I notified the state police and they said they would keep an eye on things. This area is very near Belen, New Mexico, which is where Tara Calico was abducted. It's also about 100 miles from Elephant Butte, New Mexico, which is where David Parker Ray had his little secret torture laboratory. We didn't put all of that together until later. Even though David Parker Ray had died by this time that happened, we do believe that there are others out there like him, and whoever abducted Tara has never been caught. Or maybe we came into meth lab territory. But since this happened on an actual highway rather than a backcountry road, I tend to discount the meth lab theory. Whatever is going on out there, it's not good. So let's not ever meet, or have anyone else ever meet these guys. Back in 2007, shortly after my 15th birthday, my mom was out of town for a few days on a business trip. My mom and I lived alone in a small house in a neighborhood that was on the sketchier end of decent. And that fact, combined with her paranoia about me being home alone longer than 4 or 5 hours, meant that I had to stay over at a friend's house while she was gone. This friend's house was across the street and over one house from my own. The place my mom was going was only about 2 hours away, and I'd gotten a bug up my ass about being treated like the young woman that everyone kept calling me, so for the week leading up to the trip, I was moaning and groaning about being old enough to take care of myself and insisting that I could just check in with my friend's parents every now and then. But in truth, my house was pretty creepy at night, even when my mom was there with me, and I'd found the day my mom was scheduled to leave that my friend had somehow gotten her hands on a PlayStation 3, so it didn't take me too long to get over being unfairly babysat. At around 11 on the last night I was there, we ended up back in my friend's room screwing around with the brand new flip phone I had gotten for my birthday. Her parents had gone out hours earlier after buying us pizza for dinner and probably weren't going to be back for at least an hour. And we'd gotten bored downstairs with her one PS3 game that we'd been playing for days already. It turns out she had the PlayStation but didn't have any money to actually buy games for it. It was too late to call any of her friends, but I knew my mom was coming home tomorrow morning at some ungodly hour, and I knew she had this thing about our answering machine. No matter how tired she was, no matter where she'd gotten back from, if there were any messages on the answering machine, she'd listen to all of them. Being the bored 15-year-olds we were, my friend and I decided to leave a message or two for my mom to find in the morning. We called my home phone and put it on speaker, cracking up and trying to figure out what our message was going to be about. It normally took 5 rings for a call to go to the machine, but on the 3rd ring, the phone picks up and we hear, "Hello?" The voice sounded like it belonged to some 60-year-old guy who'd been smoking for the last 40 years of his life. But even past that, there was this menace to his voice. I can't describe it exactly, but it sounded very cold and very dangerous. The sort of voice where if you heard it on the street, you'd want to get away from the person immediately. I looked at my friend. Her eyes were huge and her face was completely pale. And I'm sure I didn't look any better. Neither of us could get it together and say anything in response. "Hello?" he said again. There was a pause, and I tried to squeak out something along the lines of, "Who the hell are you and why are you in my house?" But then, he said in a very low voice, "You shouldn't have called." There was some sort of slam, and the call disconnected. I immediately dropped my phone and proceeded to freak out, as did my friend. She asked me if I knew who that was, and I said no. Of course I didn't know the creepy-ass guy answering my phone at 11 at night. We checked the call log to see if we accidentally called the wrong number. Nope, right number. We were so shaken up that we couldn't immediately figure out who we should call or what we should do. If we should call the cops, or call my mom, or call my friend's parents, or run around making sure all the doors and windows were locked, or what. So we ended up sprinting around my friend's house, double checking every lock we could check, while gasping out what happened to my friend's parents on the phone. They were about 15 minutes away, and said they'd called 911, and her mother told us to stay in my friend's room with the door locked and all the lights on in case this guy was going from house to house. And so for 10 minutes, we were huddled in the far corner of my friend's room, basically under her bed, jumping every time the house settled or one of our legs scraped on the carpet. You can imagine how freaked out we were when her parents rushed in and started rattling at her bedroom door, forgetting that it was locked on their orders. The cops got to my house not too long after her parents got home. To be honest, I don't really remember a lot of the specifics about what the cops were doing, mainly because I refused to set foot outside of the house, but I remember that they asked my friend and I a lot of questions. We couldn't really give them a lot of information, unfortunately. We called from my friend's room, which was in the back of her house, away from where we would have been able to see my house, and dude with a creepy smoker's voice isn't a very helpful description to go off of when looking for someone. One question they asked that sticks out though, because I remember thinking it was weird for them to ask, was who had keys to get into the house. I told them only my mom and I had keys. I found out later that the reason the police asked that was because there were no signs of forced entry anywhere around the house, and that the front door was wide open when they got there. There wasn't really anything messed up and nothing was taken. But our wall-mounted corded phone was hanging off the hook and the phone base itself was cracked like it'd been smashed with something. Both my mom's room and my room also had some stuff moved around and displaced, like someone was going through our drawers and stuff in our rooms. My mom got called at some point during all of this and managed to get home that night, very tired and very freaked out about what happened. The cops investigated the incident but never came up with any answers. We weren't doing too well financially at that point, but we still managed to move across town within a very few months of this happening. For the months between that night and the day we moved, though, I slept terribly and had really bad nightmares. I also flat out refused to be alone in the house, even for a couple of minutes, and started getting really obsessive about checking and double checking the locks, a habit which has stuck around since this happened. And now that I've written all of this out, I remember that there's one thing I haven't told anyone about all of this, mostly because at that time I thought that the whole thing might get blamed on me if I'd said anything. Earlier that day, I'd gone back over to my house to get a notebook of mine full of writing that I wanted to show my friend. Nothing was obviously wrong as far as I could tell. The front door was locked when I got to it, no signs of any tampering with it or any weirdness by the door, no noises from any part of the house. But the minute I stepped inside, something just felt off. Really off. It was really, really quiet. I was getting chills all up and down my spine, and I had goosebumps all over. I tried to will myself to just get over it, to go back to my room to get the notebook, but I couldn't make myself take more than a few steps into the house. I was too creeped out. I locked the door and ran back across the street. When I got back to my friend's house, I felt like an idiot, of course. Was I really such a wimp that I couldn't walk through my own house when it was empty? But looking back, well, who knows? Maybe my gut was right about something just not being right. Freaks me out even thinking about what could have happened if I'd ignored it and walked further inside the house. I've thought back on that moment a lot too, wondering if maybe I left the door open when I left, but there's no way. I distinctly remember locking the deadlock and looking over my shoulders the whole time because I had that burning, crawling feeling on the back of my neck you get when you're being watched, and after the creepy call, I checked I had my keys in my backpack. So random intruder with a creepy voice and a very mysterious, probably very sick motive for breaking into my house, let's not meet. Ever again. When I was 9 or 10, my mother had finally broken up with her wealthy yet abusive boyfriend. We had recently moved back to my hometown of Sacramento from Kingman, Arizona, and I was having trouble adjusting to our new life. Where before we lived in big, nice houses and beautiful communities with very little crime, my mom, now being a single mother of 2, moved us into a small townhouse community in not the best of neighborhoods. Luckily, I had met a girl at school I really connected with. By chance, she happened to live in a fourplex complex across the street and we quickly became inseparable, as did our mothers. Her mom was a lesbian and her girlfriend was also a good friend of my mom's. It was not unusual for them to be at our house late into the night, them up drinking and laughing in the living room, and us giggling and gossiping about the boys at our school upstairs in my room. Well, this particular night was no different. It was pretty late, so we decided to just have a sleepover. My best friend and I ran across the street to her empty house to grab her blanket and sleepover bag. We were laughing as we walked up her driveway, but she stopped, suddenly, and all the color drained from her face. No one was home, but all the lights were on in her house, and the front door was wide open, while a shadow danced on the wall. Terrified, we ran back to my house and burst through the door, both crying and babbling about a man being in the house. My uncle, who happened to be staying with us for a short while, ran over, but when he got there, the door was shut, locked, and the house was dark. The adults laughed and told us we were imagining things, that we watched too many scary movies, that it was late, and that we were tired. We both knew what we saw, and it never really left our minds. Weeks go by, and strange things start happening in her house. Doors that we closed would be open when we came back. Things in their rooms would be rearranged. Clothes and underwear started to go missing. Her mom's and girlfriend's sex toys started going missing as well. Obviously, this was left untold to us, but they were still convinced that nothing weird was going on. Until one night. It was late, and I was spending the night. My older sister was babysitting us, and we were playing Donkey Kong Country. We got bored, and my best friend mentioned she had Mario Kart in a box in their garage. The light was broken, and their landlord was more of a slumlord and never fixed anything, so we grabbed flashlights and went to search. She knew the box was in the far back corner, so we made our way around the piles of junk, when she tripped and fell. She stood up, and we both pointed our flashlights at what she fell over, and it was a pile of blankets that weren't hers. We realized that someone had made a little cubby hidden in their barely ever used garage, and we also found a hole that led outside that someone had sawed out. Needless to say, we screamed and ran inside, and my sister called 911 and our mom, who ran over to sit with us. It turns out someone had been living in their garage for weeks, if not months. Since they didn't have a washer or dryer in there, they rarely, if ever, ventured in there, so no one ever noticed. The hole the person sawed in the wall faced the back of a building, and no one ever went there, so it wasn't visible from the street or driveway. Worst of all, they found many of the things that the person had stolen when they snuck into the house. Dirty underwear, sex toys, food, pictures, etc. When he heard them leave and knew the house was empty, he would just go inside through the door and go through the things, eat their food, use their bathroom. The guy never came back, and they never caught him. The scariest part is that I spent the night there often, and who knows what could have happened had he been violent. Or maybe he was violent, and he was waiting for the right time to strike. Luckily for us, we'll never know. As a little background for this story, I'm 17, female, and Australian. I'm often the only one home in the afternoons as my father works away a lot and my mother works until late at night. Luckily, I have my lovely dog keeping me company. We rent our house and it's very old, and it shows. When we first moved in, my parents made a complaint to the realtors that the kitchen was falling apart and they said they would send someone over. A month later, it was about 2 p.m. and there was a knock on the door, and the man told me that he was there to take a look at the kitchen and that he had tried to call both of my parents but neither had answered. He looked to be in his 40s and seemed to have an Italian accent, but spoke English very well, so I understood him fine. I unlocked the screen door and allowed him in while trying to cling to the dog's collar as she was losing it. The handyman came in and told me his name, which I've since forgotten. He then asked for mine and I told him. He asked what I was doing home so early, and I explained that sometimes my classes at school finished earlier than most, and so I was able to be at home. Something about him made my hair stand on end, but I ignored it, blaming it on just being tired and paranoid. He went and fossicked around the kitchen, measuring and doing the standard stuff, and then left. When my parents came home, I told them about him, and they said that neither of their phones had missed calls. We all shrugged it off and decided that maybe he had the wrong numbers or something, but I did tell my mom that he creeped me out, and she told me to be careful around him if they weren't home. A couple of months later, more stuff broke and my parents again told the real estate. The handyman came again twice when I was alone, and he had the same story of my parents not answering the phone, and I let him in since I had my dog and I wanted to get the stuff fixed. He still made my skin crawl, so I tended to go into my room with the dog and call my best friend and talk to her while he worked. He was scared of the dog, and on the third time he came to the house, he must not have realized that she was in my room with me and tried to force the door open. The doors in this house are original, and so I have strange locks that even I can't force open if I want to, so he easily got it after about a minute. My dog threw herself off my bed and at him, and I just grabbed her before she managed to bite. I was in shock because she had never tried to really hurt someone, and some guy had just forced himself into my room. He told me that he had finished the work and wanted me to know, so that's why he opened it. But couldn't he just knock, right? I told him that he should leave in a tone that was way calmer than I felt, and off he went. I called my dad and he told me to never let him back in if I was on my own. The fourth time he came, my mom was home with me and he spoke to her in an accent that I believe had to be Turkish, and he could barely understand a word. As my mom was home, I stayed with her as she talked to him. A door in our house leading to the back garden often gets badly stuck, but on that day, we thought my dad had locked it on his way out, as he sometimes does. The handyman somehow got it open, and we assumed that it must have been stuck after all. He made both my mother and I extremely uncomfortable as he stared at me the entire time. She then refused to answer the door and told me to never answer it again if it was that handyman. My dad would be dealing with all of the interactions from then on. That was the last time I saw him for about 8 months, until 2 months ago. My dog was at the groomer, and as usual, I was home alone. I was in the kitchen starting dinner as it was about 6 p.m. and the sun was almost gone. There was a loud cry from the timber floors behind me that I ignored, as they often made noises when my dog was walking about. I can honestly tell you that it was the most horrific moment of realization when I remembered that my dog wasn't there and that there was someone behind me. I tightened my grip on the massive knife that I had been using to cut up some onion and whipped around. The handyman was there with the sickest smile on his face and a hammer in his hand. I yelled at him to get out before I called the cops and held up the knife. I was shaking and he stepped forward. I went to run past him, but he grabbed me by the hair, and in a struggle I sliced his face open and kneed him where it really hurts, so while he was in shock and agony, I ran into my room, which is right next to the kitchen, and slammed the door shut and locked it, grabbed my phone and forced the windows behind my bed open and jumped onto the rotting roof of the deck, which was attached to the outside wall directly below my window. The handyman was bashing on the door and made it in just as I jumped down on the concrete and took off running across the street to a neighbor's house. I called the emergency number, crying and telling the operator what happened and that I needed the police. I banged on the neighbor's door, begging to be let in, but no one was home, so I ran to another house with the operator still on the phone asking for details. This neighbor was home, but before she could even open the door, I hear the police sirens hurtling down the street and ran to the officers the second they stepped out of the car. The report was made, my parents were called, the media turned up, the knife was taken from me for DNA evidence, and the house was searched for him. I was taken to the hospital for a sprained ankle, whiplash from him yanking on my hair, and lots of cuts and bruises. The police found no evidence of how he had broken in, so it was assumed that he had acquired a key at some point, and neither his DNA nor fingerprints were on record. When the police contacted the real estate agent, they provided his name and phone number and claimed that he had a Swedish accent. The name was not true, and no records were found, and the number was disconnected and untraceable. They had found him on a site where he had advertised himself as a cheap handyman who could fix any and all problems, but the ad has since been removed. The police only had his description to work with, and as such, he hasn't been found. It's terrifying to think about what he would have done to me if I hadn't fought back, or if my window had not opened. I keep thinking about all of the what-ifs that could have changed my life so much or have ended it. So creepy, Swedish, Turkish, Italian handyman, let's not ever meet again. And I hope that the next girl you go after hurts you way more than I did.